In my Last of Us 2 review, I spoke a bit about the concept of prestige games, the idea that some games are obsessed with emulating films because it appears more artistic or mature, especially to people who don't play a lot of video games. People have thrown this label at a number of Sony's major releases, and while I'm not totally sure that I agree, I understand where people are coming from. In writing about prestige games, I was reminded of what I think might be a clear example of one. A Sony-exclusive game from 6 years ago that has been virtually forgotten. One that might be the blandest video game on the PlayStation 4. Let's talk about The Order 1886. The Order 1886 is a third-person shooter set in an alternate history where the Knights of the Round Table and the Holy Grail are real. Many of the knights are still alive and are devoted to slaying werewolves. Also, the technology level of the British Empire is more advanced, giving them access to giant zeppelins, machine guns, and Nikola Tesla's various fantastical contraptions. The game was developed by Ready at Dawn and published by Sony, who also provided support as the studio had made PSP games for franchises like Jak and Daxter and God of War before this. When revealed to the masses at E3 2013, The Order was seen as an early new IP for the PlayStation 4 era. This would be Ready at Dawn's first original project, one that they had wanted to make since the late 2000s. Jumping from PSP spin-offs to PS4 originals is a pretty crazy leap, so how did they do? There really isn't that much to say about The Order 1886 as far as gameplay mechanics. It's a third-person shooter that is arguably less ambitious than the first Gears of War. That might sound hyperbolic, but I think it's true. Virtually everything about this game feels factory standard. It's just another third-person shooter without much of a unique angle. The enemies you fight are very bland. It doesn't matter if they're rebels or security guards, they feel exactly the same. Sometimes they have armor, sometimes they have grenades. We've seen all of this before. The werewolves that were advertised appear very infrequently and somehow manage to wear out their welcome at the same time. Werewolves come in two sizes. The small ones appear in groups and just sort of take turns ambushing you. Keep your head on a swivel and try to shoot them before they can come in for a hit-and-run attack. It's that simple. They're never fought in groups larger than 3, and they're only fought 3 times in the entire game. The larger werewolves could be considered boss fights, but these battles don't use the standard controls. Instead, you use the right stick to dodge attacks and slice with a blade to retaliate. Large werewolves are only fought twice in the entire game, and one of these is the final boss. These fights are also heavy on QuickTime events, which can be seen across the game, usually in between gunfights. If you've played a Telltale game, then you know how these work. The timing for these is pretty generous, but sometimes you can get away with failing 1 or 2 of them in a scene without it affecting anything. Humorously, the very first thing you do in the game is a QuickTime event, but it never expires. You can just sit here indefinitely as the dialogue will repeat. There's also a few mini-games that you'll encounter, such as picking a lock or using this hacking device made by Tesla. You also use Morse code to call for air support exactly once. These might have been interesting if there were some optional uses for them that unlocked secrets, but this game is extremely linear, so that's never the case. There are specialty weapons that you get on rare occasion that can help make the game feel a little more distinct. They're thrust to you for one fight and then discarded with little opportunity to bring them into arenas that weren't specifically designed with them in mind. The funniest example of this was when you get a rocket launcher during one scene. It has unlimited ammo for whatever reason, but then your character just tosses it away when he's done, which is the last thing I would have wanted to do. Most of the standard guns are based on real weapons, but the Order rifle has a special alternate fire which allows you to stun enemies with an airburst. I like the idea. The Tesla arc was probably my favorite because you didn't really have to think while you were using it. You just charge it up for a bit and release. It'll kill enemies in one hit, and you don't have to aim. Probably the most creative gun is the thermite launcher. The bullets create flammable clouds that you can hit with the alternate fire to ignite. But again, this is a weapon that you're given once or twice, and then it's taken from you. Aside from the gimmick weapons, you have a special meter known as Black Sight that builds up in fights and is essentially just an easier-to-use version of Red Dead Redemption's Deadeye meter. You go into slow motion and can chain shots together against multiple targets. It's quite powerful, but is somewhat balanced by the fact that you can only use your sidearm in this stance. The only other addition to the game is what happens when you take lethal damage. You'll go prone with 1 hit point. If you can avoid taking damage for a few seconds, you can drink the mystical black water from a flask and come back to life. This doesn't just restore health, but the Deadeye gauge as well, so if you can guarantee that you're behind cover and won't be hit by enemies when you go down, it might actually be to your advantage to do so. That way you can turn the tables once you get back up. I personally don't understand why they would reward you for playing poorly. But I get the impression that the game's combat wasn't really meant to be that challenging. It's just there as part of the story. And make no mistake, this is a very story-focused game. So let's go over the plot summary now. The story begins in media res. A prisoner is routinely tortured by the guards, but manages to escape thanks to some QuickTime events. We learn that he was a member of the Order, and he chooses to dive off of the prison wall into the river below, rather than surrender. Then we cut back about a month in time. The prisoner's name is Grayson, and he serves the Order as Sir Galahad underneath Sir Percival, alongside Lady Igraine and Marquis de Lafayette. They stop a rebel attack in Mayfair, as well as some werewolves among their ranks. Despite a correlation between the two threats, the Lord Chancellor of the Order doesn't want knights investigating the rebels, believing that the police should handle the matter and the Order should remain focused on lycanthropes. The Council votes against investigating the rebel stronghold of Whitechapel. But Knight Commander Lucan, who along with Igraine is one of the Chancellor's adopted children, tells Sir Percival that he can investigate the rebels so long as he's discreet and accepts responsibility for whatever may happen. In Whitechapel, the Knights ditch the discreet act pretty quickly, engaging with the rebels in full force before finding more werewolves at an abandoned hospital. They uncover a rebel plot to bomb a United India Company airship and assassinate Lord Hastings, a friend of the Council, in the process. Percival decides to head to the airship immediately in order to foil the attack without waiting for the Council to approve the response. On the ship, they manage to evacuate the civilians on board, but fail to stop the rebel bombers. Galahad survives the crash, but Percival does not. Galahad tries to defend Percival's actions at his funeral, but things are cut short when rebels attempt to kill Lord Hastings at Westminster Bridge. In a rage, Galahad interrogates the rebels and heads back to Whitechapel on his own to confront their leader, Lakshmi Bai. She tells Galahad that the true enemy is the United India Company, and they assault the company's docks to find her evidence. This evidence turns out to be vampires. The company is smuggling vampires to America, and Lord Hastings is not only a vampire, but also Jack the Ripper. Lakshmi also claims that they've teamed up with the werewolves to accomplish this plan. Galahad burns the company docks along with the cargo before returning to the Lord Chancellor, who dismisses all of his claims. But Sir Lucan agrees to infiltrate the United India Company's headquarters with Galahad to find conclusive evidence. But it turns out that Lucan is actually a werewolf himself and is in league with Hastings. Galahad is arrested, charged with treason, and sentenced to death. So now we're back in the present. Galahad escapes prison by jumping into the river, but is rescued by Nikola Tesla and a mysterious man who gives him the black water to heal. It takes over 2 weeks, but Galahad recovers. Tesla has been providing the rebels with weapons this entire time, and Lakshmi explains that she was knighted by a member of the Order, presumed dead. Galahad decides to return to the Order's base to protect Tesla from harm should his involvement in the escape be discovered. Sir Lucan is already there, and the two of them fight. Lucan explains that he only supported Lord Hastings because he didn't want his kind to be exterminated. He's kept his nature a secret from everyone, including his family, except the Lord Chancellor comes out and explains that he took Lucan in as a boy after killing his entire lycanthrope village. He's known the truth this whole time and refuses to let it come out as it would likely cause the Order to crumble. He hands Galahad a gun and banishes him from the Order. Galahad points the gun at Lucan, and we get a gunshot as the credits roll. A mid-credits scene explains that martial law has been declared in London. Grayson, no longer Sir Galahad, prepares to leave with Tesla and Lakshmi to parts unknown. So that's the whole story. Feels a little incomplete, doesn't it? That's probably the biggest issue. Not only are we thrust into this world with very little exposition, but the twists that are supposed to happen all fall flat because we didn't spend enough time in this world. I didn't care about Sir Percival or his death. I didn't care about Lord Hastings because he barely had any screen time before he was revealed to be a vampire. And I definitely didn't care about the romance that was sort of a thing between Galahad and Igraine because it was portrayed in a very vague sense. This story all played out as if it was the Season 3 finale of a TV show, and I haven't seen a single episode before this. The framework that's supposed to get me invested in the characters and the world just isn't there at all. And if it felt like things were abrupt, that's because they were. The Order 1886 is a very short game. You can comfortably complete it in 4 to 5 hours. That includes cutscenes, of which there are many. It also includes the sections where you're technically in control, but you don't do much other than walk around and look at stuff like it's a detective game. In the main menu, they actually have a chapter select rather than a level select, meaning that some of these chapters are nothing but cutscenes. It's a manipulative way to make the game seem longer, as having 17 chapters seems a lot more impressive than having 7 or so levels. Even with 17 chapters, the game feels like it's missing huge chunks. It's not just the introduction that feels abridged, but the conclusion as well. There are an astounding number of loose ends by the game's finish, as if they were absolutely confident that they would get a sequel where they could explain things further. The most obvious loose end would be Lord Hastings. After Galahad is betrayed and arrested, he makes a brief appearance at the trial, and that's the last time he's ever seen. The game doesn't give me much to go off of, but I think his plan was to keep the Order distracted by the werewolves in London so that the United India Company could freely smuggle vampires out of the country to places like America and India where there presumably aren't any knights. The nature of the werewolves within the rebellion is hand-waved in one line telling us that they work for Hastings, which doesn't feel like enough. I think that they may have been intended to be double agents, put there to give the Order a reason to hunt down the rebels, which keeps the United India Company's secrets safe. Except that the Lord Chancellor and the Council still don't want to go after the rebels despite Lord Hastings lobbying for it at the meeting. There's not really a reason for this other than the Chancellor is just stubborn. Nothing suggests that he was in on the conspiracy. I guess that's why Lucan told Percival to head to Whitechapel anyways, but then he was pissed off when he learned that Percival had launched a full assault. Was it not the conspiracy's desire to see the rebels eliminated? If so, what exactly did Lucan expect them to find in Whitechapel? Maybe he wanted them to find the evidence of the airship attack so that they could stop it? But if he knew that the rebels were planning that, then why would he and Lord Hastings be on the airship at all? It might not matter. By the story's end, it seems like the Order has fully committed to going after the rebels in London, so the vampires are still in control by the end of the day. Galahad used what opportunities he had after escaping to save Tesla from Lucan, which didn't seem to change anything in the grand scheme. Again, Tesla isn't developed enough as a character to make me have much interest in his survival. I think my favorite loose end would have to be the mysterious man who shows up with Tesla to save Galahad's life. Since he has the Blackwater, I presume that he was a knight at some point. This man is actually shown twice earlier in the game. Galahad spots him talking to Percival from a distance, but when he confronts him about it on the airship, he just waves it off and says that he'll explain things later. And then he dies. We still have no idea who this man is or what he told Percival. He could be literally any of the Knights of the Round Table who don't appear in the game. That's not a short list of candidates. The closest thing to a hint that I noticed would be the mention of Sir Bors by Lakshmi. Apparently he gave her the Blackwater, so she has the same enhanced vitality as the Order. But she also implies that Bors is no longer alive, so that's not much of a hint. There's also a few audio logs which you can find that are written to members of an anarchist group. They seem to be observing the events of the game and may be aware of the vampires' control over England and the company. By the end of the game, they fled to America to avoid martial law, so they don't really matter to the story, but I feel like this is a thread that would be picked up in a sequel. Similarly, there are 2 scenes with Galahad's sidekicks that seem to have been put there to tease at their roles in the sequel. Igraine more or less looks straight into the camera and vows to crush the rebellion, while Lafayette visits Galahad before he sets off to rescue Tesla and implies that he's more loyal to the ideals of liberty than the Order itself, but he doesn't do anything that affects the story of this game. It's frustrating to even spend much time thinking about this stuff. Far too much of The Order 1886 feels like a trailer for a story about Grayson becoming a rebel, but why couldn't that have just been the last few stages of this game? All of that story grist was crushed into one final stage, just when the story might have been going somewhere. So if the gameplay is uninteresting, and the story is full of holes, what is there to appreciate about The Order? I guess it would be the art direction and the world building. Obviously, that's going to be quite subjective, but here's my take. Despite the enhanced technology, London itself doesn't seem that different from how it would have looked in 1886. With the exception of the submachine gun, most of the real-world guns that appear in the game are only about 10 or so years off, so they don't seem fantastically out of place. Things like the giant airship or a Tesla arc have somehow had the fun sucked out of them. I definitely would have liked to see the fantastic technology pushed a bit further, and this is coming from someone who isn't really a fan of steampunk. Likewise, very little is done with the alternate history element. Despite the English somehow having all of this advanced tech, nothing has really changed. The United States still came to be, and there aren't really any references to the colonial state of affairs outside of the United India Company. Maybe they should have pushed the geopolitical changes a bit further to cement that this is indeed an alternate history. And this is coming from someone who isn't really a fan of the British Empire. Having Tesla basically be the Order's Q is neat, and I like the inclusion of Lafayette because I think he's an interesting figure. But other than an odd scene where Arthur Conan Doyle is the chief of police and he kind of acts like Sherlock Holmes, they don't really get into the fun of alternate history in the same way that some other games like some of the Assassin's Creed titles would. And if you're a fan of King Arthur and werewolves, there isn't that much for you here either. The knights in the game are just adopting the titles of the original Round Table members, so they aren't actually those characters. They don't have anything special going for them outside of the Blackwater, which just kind of feels like it's there to help justify why our characters can survive so much injury. The half-breeds have also been made quite mundane. Even the most basic folklore pertaining to them has been cast aside. No need to use silver on werewolves, I guess. Likewise, you can kill a vampire just by stabbing it with a knife. You know, like a normal person. Look, I get that these are fantasy creatures, and there aren't really rules that you have to follow when you use them, but I find that leaning into those aspects is part of the fun of using those creatures. It seems as though the Order was conceived around the 3 pillars of legendary folklore, alternative history, and Victorian steampunk. But it didn't push any of them far enough. Like they weren't totally confident in that vision. It's a shame because I don't hate it, but it needed so much more. The inclusion of Lakshmi Bai got me thinking about how many other international legends must be true in this world. I suppose that might have been interesting material for a sequel, but it's too late to speculate about that now. I think that I still have to stand by my statement about this being the blandest game on the PS4. Shooters are already a genre where games have been afraid to take risks. But I've played some shooters that were just as forgotten as this one, but they at least tried to come up with some unique selling point. The Bureau XCOM Declassified placed great emphasis on tactical positioning and squad control, while Fuse supported 4-player co-op and each character had a distinctive primary weapon. A part of me almost feels like they resisted gameplay innovation because it would have taken away from another one of this game's major goals, to be cinematic. Now, it could be very easy to dismiss this goal by reminding you that the story isn't good enough to deserve such attention, but let's really get into this. The Order 1886 does have great graphics. Environments and character models have been very well realized, especially when you remember that this came out in early 2015. And they don't just look realistic, they look like sets and props from a film, so cinematic isn't the worst word to use to describe things. However, many attempts to be cinematic come at a cost, the greatest of which I shouldn't have to mention because you've been seeing it this entire time. These black bars at the top and bottom of the screen, These are always present because the entire game is framed in the 2.4:1 widescreen aspect ratio that's used in movie theaters. For comparison, HD games and television shows are framed in the 1.7:1 aspect ratio, more commonly called 16:9. This in no way enhanced the game for me. It just kept reminding me of how many pixels on my TV weren't being taken advantage of. This is an incredibly clear example of something that the so-called prestige game would do. Films have wide aspect ratios, and films are seen as more artistic than games, therefore our game needs to have a wide aspect ratio. But even Naughty Dog wasn't trying to do things like this. It feels like a totally misguided effort, and it in no way helps the cutscenes and gameplay feel connected for me. Aside from this, there are some times where camera effects that seem nice in cutscenes become problems in gameplay. There's so much blur on the screen, even when you're in a firefight. Since enemies and environments often share the same drab color palette, it can be difficult to see them or know when it's safe to return fire. There just isn't much clarity to the action, which is important for an action game. Yes, I think it's cool how games can emulate cinematic effects. Sometimes I enjoy them, but they need to be used in moderation. Otherwise, you get something like this, which almost feels like a parody. So that's mostly all there is to say about The Order 1886. It's not terribly clear how well this game sold, but given that the price was permanently cut by 1/3 after only being out for a month, I'd say that there were some problems. Sales were likely impacted by some very average reviews as well as the game's length. Someone got a copy of the game about a week early and uploaded their entire playthrough to YouTube. That's when people realized that it was only about 5 hours long, which caused some pushback. Ready at Dawn tried to counter this by saying that the length of a game isn't an indicator of quality. That's not entirely wrong, but it just doesn't apply to this example. The Order 1886 was a full-priced third-person shooter, so it should be as long as its contemporaries such as Uncharted or Gears of War. Not only was it much shorter, but it doesn't offer a better experience in any way, especially when you consider that it lacks any form of multiplayer options and the few collectible bits of lore that you can find offer a minimal incentive to replay the game. It just doesn't have the replay value, which is important when you're selling a short game for a higher price point. Even now I feel that $20 is way too much for how little you're going to get out of it. You can get more fun out of just one of Resident Evil 6's campaigns than you get out of this entire game. It's a total deal breaker, and I think that you can safely skip The Order if you're trying to catch up on Sony's published games. There is one other factor that I think played a role in this game's lack of reception. Sony released a game themed around Victorian fantasy, weird technology, and werewolves around the same time. That's right. Bloodborne released just 1 month after The Order. Obviously, that's a very different kind of action game, but it sucked up all the attention. If you ask someone, what's that PS4 game where you hunt werewolves? They will say Bloodborne every time. That's the game that people are clamoring for a sequel to and demanding be ported to PC. The Order just doesn't have the interest from the masses. I'm not even sure if it has a fan base at all. The Order 1886 was the last project that Sony would publish for Ready at Dawn. 2 years later, they released an online multiplayer game called Deformers that was published through GameStop of all companies. I had no idea this game existed until I started making this video, and the servers were shut down after just 1 year. But it seems like the company has found a little more success with Lone Echo for the Oculus Rift. Facebook actually bought out Ready at Dawn in 2020. So like it or not, it seems that VR is their future now. From reading interviews, it sounds like Sony is the only partner that owns The Order as a property. They would have to hand the reins to another studio, but I'm not sure that they even want to bother. Unless the gameplay was totally reimagined, a sequel to 1886 would seem a lot more dated than even the first game was when it came out. So I'd much rather see other projects get advanced. I've been reviewing games for a while now, and it's often the most mediocre games that can be the hardest to write about. But I think that I've pushed myself to say everything that I can when it comes to The Order. If there's a lesson to be learned from it, it's that you can't just coast on bog-standard gameplay trends or pretty graphics, and you definitely can't rely on a widescreen aspect ratio to make you seem professional. This game was about King Arthur's knights using Tesla guns to fight werewolves, but it managed to suck out all of the fun of that concept. That's honestly kind of impressive, but for all the wrong reasons. Before you worry about hyperrealism or the cinematics, you need to make sure that you're expressing the core concept of your game to the audience as effectively as you can. Otherwise, it'll be half-baked, unrealized, just like this. And if you're one of the few people out there who really likes the Order for whatever reason, you do you. Just try not to get mad when people think you're talking about Bloodborne. That's the video, folks. I hope that you enjoyed it, and please let me know in the comments what you think about The Order 1886, or what game I should review next. I've still got that list, and it's getting a bit bigger. Maybe I'll show it off sometime soon, probably on Twitter, so you can follow me there. I don't tweet a whole lot, but I'm trying to get better at it, even though I don't really enjoy the experience of the site. Either way, that's all I have to say, so have a good day, and I'll see you later.